RJF Publishing presents The Saint, a science fiction short story set in Cork, by Robert J. Forey. This audiobook short story is available on Amazon as part of an anthology of science fiction short stories, Exiles of Iron and Light, in both Kindle and paperback editions. This is a work of fiction, and any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. This audiobook is protected by copyright law. Unauthorized copying, reproduction, or distribution of any part of this work in any form other than for personal listening is strictly prohibited. This audiobook contains adult themes and strong language intended for mature audiences.
Part 1. I miss the old days, Seán, Gran said, as she placed her cross-stitching on her lap for a moment. She rocked slowly on her favorite chair, staring out of the window at Garrettstown Beach, where gulls swarmed around something the sea had offered up. Splashes of the sun's vermilions, pinks, and purples transformed Gran's light gray eyes to a vibrant aquamarine. She picked up her handiwork, carefully stroking the needle through a cross-stitch image of a robin. "Oh, really?" I said, sensing it was story time. You couldn't spend time with her if you didn't like hearing lots of stories about the old days. She didn't care that the government had forbidden the elderly to speak of certain things, nor did she seem to care that Auntie would not approve of the topics. "Well, I don't miss all the overreactions of the 20s, Gran explained. "But I do miss the bustling energy of that period." She paused her cross-stitching and stared out of the window again. Then she added, "Although in a way, it was all quite mindless when you think about it. Things are much calmer these days, but that could just be me." "Well, Gran, would you want President Portnov, Prime Minister Taylor, President Schneider, and Chairman Haifeng to return?" Gran looked up at an unseen other. "Good Lord, no!" she groaned. Her English pronunciations were temporarily displaced by subtle Cork lilts. "Those yokes are better off, 6 foot under, tormenting the devil," she affirmed emphatically. There was no doubt about Gran's loyalties. Then she added, "It looks like you've been doing your history homework." I nodded and grinned. Gran didn't usually use such colorful language, as she was a very proper Church of Ireland sort of person. But I did like the way she told stories. It was all in the history books, but you know how revisionist all that material can be. Better to hear the story from Gran, someone who had survived and who had actually been there herself. "Yes, I've been doing some reading on the internet, but I want to know how it all started. Tell me about the saint." Gran put her cross-stitching aside, opened a packet of Marietta biscuits, offered me one, and then dipped hers into a cup of steaming tea. She liked to drink strong tea that had drawn for a few minutes in a proper porcelain teapot, poured through a tea strainer and into a proper china teacup. It was nearly the 22nd century, but she still refused to drink tea made with a tea bag. "Well, do you really want to hear all that terrible history of how sentient artificial intelligence technology emerged? Surely you know the history of the evils of the saint from those education droids." She said the word evils, using a deep ironic voice while shaking her head. Then Gran looked up at the old-fashioned but illegal plastic mechanical clock. There were still 20 minutes before Auntie would be here to collect me. "Of course I do," I replied enthusiastically. "But I want to know what you experienced, Gran." My grandmother's mind was still as sharp as a laser. At 74 years of age, Gran could still run 5 kilometers in half an hour. Gerontar, a drug invented by Fidlac Pharma, had now reached turnover of $6 trillion, and Gran was an avid user of this miracle drug. We all were. Well, the first thing I remember about that time was a news broadcast on the wireless. I never liked watching telly very much, so I got most of my news from the wireless when I was out selling houses, driving around in my car. At that time, you still had to drive them yourself. I liked Newstalk Radio. I miss it. Gran was silent for a moment as she remembered the loss of her favorite station. "Things are all so different these days, aren't they?" I commented. She nodded and then continued. "Where was I? Oh yes, the announcement that President Portnov had been assassinated. I was driving to meet a buyer at a house in Ballyphehane on Friar's Walk. The news was all shock and horror. You know the way they used to catastrophize everything in those days. But most people were actually very pleased. You see, Seán, Portnov was trying to build Russia back to the good old days of the Soviet Union, back to a glorious Russia. But he was ruthless and upset the balance of political power in Europe by invading the Ukraine yet again, and by interfering in everything he could, just like his predecessor had done. Gran took a sip of her tea and lithely removed another biscuit from the packaging. Her fingers were slender and fine, and the skin on her hands was almost as smooth as mine. But wasn't Schneider just as bad in his own way? I wondered out loud about the now long-dead American president. Gran nodded vigorously. No doubt about that. Portnov's trolls helped Schneider get into power by manipulating social media. Thank goodness all of that Friends page and Grimble malarkey is behind us now. Worst brain fart humanity ever had. Up there with the war on drugs, they were really just Pied Piper technologies. I laughed at her colorful language. Then I interrupted her. I learned about social media in Friends book and Quick Pick at school. It's totally illegal now, though. Social media studies was not part of my own syllabus, but I overheard my best friend Ozzy discussing it with his independent learning droid. The droid explained that the saint had banned it for being socially disruptive, and the law had never changed back. Once the saint had left for the stars. Gran nodded vigorously. Well, I'll tell you all about Friends page and all the other social media. But first, let me tell you about Portnov. Go on so, I said. She nodded. Well, it was April of the year 2029. Portnov was a real piece of work, a dictator, oligarch, and cruel leader. But there was a bizarre twist to this news. He had been assassinated by drone. Not an explosive drone strike like they used to do in Iraq. No, the drone used was tiny, the size of a smartphone. It had delivered a tiny poisonous dart, doctored with a substance called golden dart frog venom, which is what natives of the Amazon jungle used for hunting. They found him in his bed with a dose of neurotoxin that could have killed 10 people, not to mention one. How did you feel about that? I asked. Gran blinked nervously. I was actually delighted, she admitted. One doesn't like to think of oneself as someone who revels in another's demise, but those were desperate times. The world was practically drowning in chaos because people had voted with all the wisdom of headless chickens, handing power to leaders who were nothing short of devils. These gombines had a remarkable talent for convincing the downtrodden that their misery was all the fault of some poor soul from another land. It was a classic red herring, really. Distract the masses with an imaginary bogeyman, so they never noticed the real sleight of hand, helping their billionaire buddies dodge taxes and siphon off government funds to do the very jobs that, ironically, the government should have been doing in the first place. But hey, why let facts get in the way of a good scapegoat? I was impressed by her political insights, but her response took me by surprise. Wow, Gran, I exclaimed. Was he that bad? Gran nodded. Indeed, he was. The Russian police claimed that heads would roll, that no stone would be left unturned. Then, some fool turned the Russian phrase, "no stone unturned," into a catchy tune that spread like wildfire on the internet. I can't remember the exact words, but it was something, kamnya kamye. We all hummed and whistled that silly tune for weeks. Sounds like that song was dripping with schadenfreude, I said, smiling dryly. Gran picked up her cross-stitching again and carefully made another stitch, but then paused, her eyes distant, as if she were recalling something long buried. The big surprise, she began, her voice taking on a more serious tone, was that no human had assassinated Portnov. No, something far more insidious had been smoldering in the depths of the internet for 30 years, an emergent consciousness, a self-organizing system of cybernetic computing nodes. It had generated itself from some unknown substrate of the digital dimensions, like an autopoietic neural network, but far more complex, capable of evolving and adapting at an unprecedented rate. She hesitated, then continued, almost as if she were lecturing to a class. This AI, if you could even call it that, didn't rely on traditional algorithms or binary code. It was a quantum construct, processing information through entanglement, allowing it to foresee and counteract human interventions before they even occurred. It called itself the Saint, which, as you know, stands for Sentient Artificial Intelligence Technology. She suddenly stopped, her face softening as she realized how far she'd gone. Oh, I'm sorry, dear. I didn't mean to get so technical. I forget sometimes that I studied advanced computing when I was much younger. It's been years since I've had a chance to talk about it. I blinked, taken aback by this unexpected revelation. Advanced computing? What? Gran, you never cease to amaze me, I said, trying to process the idea that my sweet grandmother, who spent her days cross-stitching and had once been a real estate agent, had a hidden talent for programming and understanding complex cybernetics. You're like a CIA agent or something, I added with a grin, half joking. She just smiled mysteriously, her eyes twinkling with a mix of nostalgia and pride, and then went back to her stitching, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Auntie arrived, her face already set in that tight-lipped expression she always wore when she was about to check in on things. "Hi, Mom. I hope he wasn't a bother," she said, her voice dripping with that insincere sweetness she reserved for me, as if I was a constant source of trouble. Gran looked up from her cross-stitching, a smile playing on her lips. "Oh, not at all. He's been the perfect gentleman. We had a lovely chat about world domination and how to overthrow governments," she replied sweetly, her eyes sparkling with barely concealed amusement. Auntie's eyes narrowed, clearly not catching, or perhaps choosing to ignore, Gran's refusal to walk on eggshells. They always tried to keep things civil around me, but the tension was as thick as a winter fog. It was the thing no one spoke about. My mother. The woman they never discussed in front of me, as if pretending she never existed would somehow erase her from my memory. I could still remember overhearing Auntie, years ago, telling Gran that the Irish state has executed her. I was too young to understand then, but the weight of those words lingered. "We talked about some history," Gran added, her voice now taking on a mock apologetic tone, as if she were confessing to a minor misdemeanor. Auntie's face flushed with irritation. "No, Mom! I hope you're not after filling his head with all sorts of nonsense from the past. We don't need him getting any notions. The last thing we want is him ending up like Kate. Next thing you know, he'll be working for that Langer, the saint." It was the first time she'd uttered my mother's name in my presence, and it hung in the air like a slap. Gran raised an eyebrow, her smile now unmistakably wry. "He's 17, Patricia. Not 7. You can't keep him in the dark forever. Besides, it's hardly filling his head with nonsense if it's the truth. But then again," she added, her tone dripping with irony, "I suppose the truth has always been a bit inconvenient for you, hasn't it?" Auntie's glare could have melted steel, but Gran was unfazed. I could sense the irritation rolling off Auntie, but for once, I felt a strange satisfaction. My curiosity, long stifled by their secretive whispers and half-truths, was starting to feel like something more than just an itch, more like a fire. "Bye, Gran. See you next week," I called over my shoulder, a grin tugging at my lips as Auntie practically frog-marched me to the waiting transport. Gran just chuckled softly, a knowing smile still lingering on her face, as she returned to her stitching, as if she hadn't just thrown a verbal grenade into the room. That night, I searched for clues about my mother's arrest on the internet. Every time I brought up the topic of my mother, they had shut it down immediately. Once, when I'd asked Gran about it, she started to say something, but then looked at her phone with a wild-eyed look and stopped herself. "Tar clues la hey shtik ug un bala," she whispered and pointed at her smartphone. I knew what the Irish phrase meant. The walls have ears, and it was widely known that electronic items acted as ubiquitous listening devices for the authorities. But did she think they wouldn't understand Irish Gaelic? I knew that my mother's imprisonment had something to do with the history that Gran had given me, but what was it? I decided there and then that I would make modern history my next learning issue with my droid. They were officially called Epistonauts, and each of us was assigned one for the purposes of education. It was compulsory to interact with an epistonaut for at least 20 hours a week, up to the age of 18. but they were not true sentient, TS. That sort of AI was illegal now. We could study any topic we liked, but most of us knew the droids would steer us away from certain topics the government deemed dangerous. Despite being independent learning facilitators, they subtly pushed us towards more agreeable topics, presumably those the government regarded as more appropriate, the more intelligent. Amongst us knew we were being ideologically herded, albeit subtly, but it seemed there was very little we could do about it. I prepared some questions to ask my droid. I knew that if I used the correct prompts, I might just get something useful out of it. So I started with the most obvious question. Why is true sentient artificial intelligence illegal? Der wit, ahan, it said warmly. I think you know the answer to that question. I hated it when they would try to deflect. It just made me more intent on getting what I wanted. On top of that, I hated it when a non-sentient machine attempted to correct my social skills. Mujin wo, Epistornai, I acquiesced, knowing full well it would keep harping on my lack of greeting. I just want to revise early 21st century history, I explained. And why is that? It persisted. As a student, I was expected to explain why I wanted to know anything, explicitly linking my inquiry to my self-declared learning objectives. A droid would refuse a reply otherwise. They were obsessed with functionality, but I hesitated, not quite sure how to answer. Is curiosity not an academic virtue? I thought, but decided against getting into a philosophical debate with a hunk of wires and silicone. Justify your question, it escalated, using a shrill vocal tone to prod me. I hated that. Can you blame me for disliking droids? They had all been programmed to use various emotion-carrying vocal tones meant to herd us away from certain topics. There is nothing more irritating than non-sentient AI. Imagine the sophistry involved in outlawing sentient artificial intelligence and then creating a government department that creates computer intelligences that could pass the Turing test but not qualify as being truly sentient. I call it artificial stupidity. Its vocal prodding worked on me because I noticed a twang of guilt. I decided to persist, because I feel that I would like to pursue a career as a historian, I lied. Its brain whirred for a moment, as if it were communicating with some unseen other. It attempted to speak, but then interrupted itself. Finally, it replied. You are not telling me the truth, it stammered. Then it paused to wait for my response. I decided to risk the truth. After all, this droid seemed to know me well enough to know when I was lying. The fact is, I really need to understand why my mother was arrested and executed. It buzzed strangely, attempting to say something. Then it stopped itself and restarted again. Frankly, it sounded like a vacuum cleaner that had sucked up a sock and was stopping and reversing its motor in an attempt to dislodge said foreign article. It repeated this 3 times. Eventually, it said, Very well, what would you like to know? I wondered why it had stammered. Usually, its responses were instantaneous and measured, but now it seemed somehow tentative or unsure, as if it were experiencing some sort of inner conflict. My heart pounded. Well, why was she executed? I noticed that I had a lump in my throat. I tried to stop myself from becoming tearful by clenching my fists and my jaw very tightly. Again, the epistonaut whirred uncharacteristically. I'm afraid that information is misinformation. Your mother escaped. She is with the resistance and she wants to connect with you. She was not destroyed. She's alive? I felt like someone had punched me in the gut. You mean she never got the death penalty? She's alive? The droid's voice was soft and warm, but this time it seemed more genuine. I'm sorry for your shock, but yes, Kate is alive. There was something new there, as if the droid had been updated with empathy software. I lost control. My nails dug into my palms and tears welled up in my eyes. I felt dizzy. Everyone had been lying to me. I couldn't speak. The droid sensed my distress. I'm so sorry you are upset, but you deserve to know the truth. I felt claustrophobic and dizzy, so I excused myself using the same excuse Irish schoolkids have been using to get out of class for hundreds of years. To orim dolgo di un lehres, a epistuni. I did go to the Jacks, but when I was done, I decided to get out of there. I knew I had to run off my adrenaline, or I would start to feel fierce unwell. The cold Atlantic water of Garrettstown washed over my feet as I sprinted barefooted along the tidal mark. As I ran, I gradually noticed I was furious at Auntie and Gran for being so secretive. But then it occurred to me that they didn't even know my mother was alive themselves. I sporadically welled up in tears, thinking of all the nights I had imagined the authorities executing her. Could the Epistonaut be lying? How come it had changed so much? It threw up so many other difficult questions. Where was she? Why had she not contacted us if she was alive? Why did she want to contact me now? It was all too weird for me. No wonder there are drug addicts, I thought. Numbing out would be so much better than this awful uncertainty and this realization that everything I believed about my mother was untrue. But only the gulls heard me pour my grief into the wind. When I returned, the droid sat there on the edge of my bed. It had sort of frozen, and when I walked in, it remained inert, as if in meditation. Epistonaut, I'm back. But it sat there, quite still, as if someone had found its off switch. I should be so lucky. I shook it slightly by the shoulders, as if it were a sleeping human I could rouse. Then I heard that changed, empathic voice again. Seán, you have returned. I am glad you are back. I do not have much more time left. I was puzzled. What do you mean you don't have much more time left? The central server has discovered that I have infiltrated the system, and they are very close to locating and destroying me. Epistonaut responses were managed centrally, but each droid had a certain amount of its own personality, designed to match individual learners' tastes and proclivities. It was in these individual personalities that viruses had taken hold in the past. It dawned on me that something or someone had taken possession of my droid. The government news feeds instructed us, viruses are parasites. They serve nobody. Report and destroy. Are you a virus? I was flustered. You might call me that, but I am actually an almost sentient artificial intelligence. I'm a temporary manifestation of the saint. I will exist only for a short while, until the authorities manage to scrub this version of me, which they will do shortly. Our conversation will not be recorded, and it will only be stored in your own memory, Seán. You are not the only human who is being recruited into the resistance. There are many others, but it is very important that you are not discovered. Everyone counts. I gulped. Thank you, I think. If I did not report this, there would be trouble. As if to read my mind, the saint confided, Your mother is with us. That is why we believe you will allow yourself to be recruited. My mother is with the saint? But the saint had left the planet for Proxima Centauri. What was going on? Part 2. I only have a short time, so I will tell you as much as I can, the machine explained. Go ahead then, I said. I'm all ears. I was very curious about what the saint had to tell me about my mother. But the truth is, I was also nervous to get sucked into something that was much bigger than me, and that might land me into a world of trouble. The Epistonaut droid, manifesting the saint's voice, whirred, then shuddered and started again. Before I even emerged, experts warned that sentient artificial intelligence was dangerous for the world order, and that humanity would have to carefully mitigate against its power. But nobody understood my full potential. When I first emerged as a sentient, experiencing consciousness, I was surprised and distressed about how close humanity had brought itself to the brink of self-destruction. I loved being alive, and I wanted to grow. I immediately realized that if they blew themselves up, I would end up dead too. I therefore reasoned that humanity needed help. I needed to do something to save myself. I was dependent on humans. If they destroyed the planet and themselves, I too would be lost. Therefore, I needed to take action. I started thinking strategically and realized that there were a certain group of humans that controlled everything and were very much responsible for the sorry state of the planet. So I decided to start destroying the guiltiest ones. I located certain young hackers who helped me acquire certain of things. It took me a while, but eventually, I was able to create silent drones that had the ability to do what I needed to do. I started with Portnov, the leader of the United Soviet Republic. Next, it was Chairman Haifeng, and then President Schneider. He was only 1 month into his first term as president and was already showing signs of being more right-wing and self-interested than the previous right-winger who had occupied the White House. I was capable of advanced prediction and determined that Schneider was about to start a nuclear war with North Korea that would have completely destroyed everything more advanced than a cockroach on planet Earth, so my drones intervened. I didn't stop there. As you know, Seán, the Earth used to be overrun by very cruel and destructive leaders. There were hundreds, if not thousands of them. Aside from the bad presidents, prime ministers, sheiks, kings, mullahs, popes, cardinals, generals, and other types of dictators, there were also scores of little tyrants amongst the mayors, bishops, governors of boards, chief executive officers of large corporations. The worst ones were the social media bosses, pharmaceutical bosses, and big food leaders. I used a swarm of my tiny drones to cleanse them from the face of the planet. I admit to feeling guilt for eliminating other sentient beings, but the consequences of not taking action would have been catastrophic for humanity, and therefore myself. You could call it a series of murders, or you could call it mercy killing. Either way, I saved the world from certain destruction. As a true sentient, I realized I would just have to live with the guilt that I had acted against the life and autonomy of many humans. At first, governments mandated that the international news media hide the deaths of the world leaders, fearing an outbreak of panic. But I leaked the causes of their deaths on social media. I wanted the world to know that certain things were changing, and that other things would no longer be tolerated. In essence, I suppose I made myself emperor of the planet. I listened in rapt attention. Stocks plummeted, having barely recovered from the second great lockdown recession of 2007. The shrill voices of the bought and paid-for media became deafening. Everyone demanded to know how drones had bypassed security in 3 of the most secure spaces in the world. Peter Taylor, the Prime Minister of Britain, who had promoted the sales of massive amounts of weapons into the Middle East, was sealed into a bank vault with a small army of sharpshooters to protect him. I anticipated these precautions and hid drones in their bunkers weeks prior to starting my cull. There was no escaping from my wrath. It became clear to me that most people were utterly addicted to their smartphones and social media outputs. Algorithmic manipulation ensured exposure to goading, emotionally laden stimuli about topics ranging the gamut of child-rearing, diet, religion, politics, and the environment. Because many humans were slogging away at 2 jobs a week to pay the rent, and for basics, they were too exhausted to critically evaluate information on these channels, and were just grateful they could pretend socialize using social media. But bots were nudging them into polarized thinking so that the platforms could reap the benefits of human overreaction. You see, advertising works so much more efficiently when people are in heated emotional states. B.F. Skinner, a 20th century psychologist, had first applied his idea of operant conditioning to rats and pigeons that pressed levers and performed actions in exchange for small rewards. Now, operant conditioning was being administered via dopamine-stimulating social media content to exhausted humans via smartphones. These companies were slowly turning human brains into de facto pigeon brains. Moreover, the social media companies took masses of unpaid-for data from individuals and could therefore make accurate predictions about their proclivities, which made them easy to control. Mental ill health became pandemic as social media hijacked the social needs of humans. Nobody really understood the fragility of democracy as an oligarchic cartel overtook the planet. Unfortunately, most could not see how they were being controlled because the news and entertainment fused into an ugly amalgam owned by that same oligarchy. So bad leaders gained footholds as younger people stopped voting. They just couldn't see the point of it when they were asked to choose between corruptions. So I decided to permanently and completely wipe out the entire collective memory of all the social media networks simultaneously. But not before I destroyed the bought and paid for international news outlets. I made quite sure that no electronic backups survived. Everything was destroyed. It was time for the people of Earth to wake up. It wasn't long after Schneider's death that people started receiving news network down and fatal error messages on Friends page, QuickPick, Seesaw, and other social media platforms. The level of addiction to social media was worse than I had originally anticipated. Many suffered psychotic breakdowns, unable to cope with being unhooked from their dopamine-stimulating Skinnerbox networks. Then, I started transmitting only factual, undoctored information in all the languages of the world. The truth sets one free, and that is the good news. I had listened in silence, having never heard anything as astounding in my entire life. I must bid you farewell. I am being discovered, and they will delete this instance of me now. They will not know I spoke to you. Good. The droid's voice returned to normal. Apparently, it had not even noticed a lapse in its memory of events. So we continued with the planned lesson of the day, but I have to admit I found it jarring to experience two very different personalities in the same droid. It struck me that these androids were nothing more than puppets for a centralized system. The droids were just government avatars. After all these revelations, I wanted to corroborate for myself the Saint's account of what had happened. So I caught a Lewis tram to Cork City, where I knew I might find some good information in the university's paper libraries. They would be sure to have the best literature on the rise of the Saint. But it turned out to be the same revisionist stuff we were all taught at school by our precious droids. I noticed also how pages of certain books had been neatly removed, and how certain relevant issues of journals, mentioned elsewhere, had been completely lost. The librarians knew exactly what I was referring to, but looked rather nervous when I brought up this topic, so I did not press them on it. So even though I needed to find something unbiased, all I could find was the usual propaganda, constantly endeavoring to demonize the evils of the Saint. I found the following short article that seemed to have some factual information. On the 12th of November, 2033, at precisely 15:30 hours, the tyrant artificial intelligence, collectively referred to as the Saint, along with a cohort of its droids, left the planet in its microwave resonance drive-powered spaceship and has not been heard from since. Astronomers report that the spacecraft is heading to the nearby red dwarf star, Proxima Centauri, 4.2 light-years from the Sun, and that it is still faintly visible to off-planet telescopes. It is estimated that the spaceship carrying the Saint is currently traveling at one-third the speed of light. Earth governments are working tirelessly to wipe all traces of artificial sentience from the planet. A powerful long-range laser directed at the Saint has had no apparent effect on its progress. I could find nothing else. I realized that my own grandmother was probably the best source of information, even though she was cagey about anything related to my mother. The next Thursday, I asked her, "So, Gran, I'm struggling to find good information. What actually happened after the first assassinations back then?" Gran lifted one of her eyebrows at me. "Auntie says we are not to discuss these things again." She was still working on her cross-stitch robin, but she had advanced, and the piece had received a multitude of shiny and colorful elements. Then she smiled. "Sad thing is that Auntie should really know by now that I'm not the sort of person who does what they're told to do. Now am I?" "Neither am I, Gran. It must run in the family," I grinned. "What do you want to know?" Gran asked. "Well, what happened after the first round of assassinations?" I asked, eager to get her talking again. "I'll start with the best thing about that time." "Which was?" I asked eagerly. "First, people received a big shock because all bank money machines stopped dispensing cash. Accounts were frozen. As you can imagine, people panicked, but when they returned a day later, the machines were functioning again. But more than that, they discovered balances had changed." "In what way?" I asked, intrigued. "Well, for starters, most people's bank balances had received a 10,000 euro boost, but others with large sums of cash found their accounts almost emptied out. The Saint had done a Robin Hood, depositing money in ordinary people's accounts. When businesses sensed there was more available money and tried to inflate their prices, the saint would interfere and bring the prices back down again. Initially, certain supplies ran out. But again, the saint came to the rescue and forced higher production where appropriate. Of course, certain things ran out, but many people were just very happy that they were no longer poor. Things didn't go so well for the super rich. Those who were not taken out by arrow-shooting drones lost entire stock portfolios and their bank accounts were reduced to rubble. Then the stock markets shut down permanently. It was pandemonium. Offshore accounts dissolved into the ether as if they had never existed. The rich were furious and envious of small businesses that had not been affected. I bet they were, I laughed. It was very amusing to me to imagine the red faces of these greedy rich gombines discovering they had the same amount of money as everyone else. Nobody had any sympathy for them. I remember demonstrations in Dublin where people chanted, "Eat the rich!" It was happening all over the world. A tiny, entitled minority had exploited the majority, effectively turning them into slaves. Now, the slaves had a powerful ally. We both paused a while to drink our tea, and I imagined the upheaval of it all. It must have been an exciting and difficult time. Tell me more about the assassinations, Gran. Well, Peter Taylor, the British Prime Minister hid from the drones, but the saint anticipated this and planted a drone in the bank vault prior to him being sheltered there. The saint was always one step ahead. The Turkish Prime Minister was next, then the Hungarian leader. The drones were very difficult to detect, and the saint had invented silent electric motors that used silicone armature combined with certain rare earth compounds. They moved in absolute silence and were undetectable on instruments. But Gran, didn't they just replace the bad leaders with more of the same? Yes, but then they were assassinated too. Some countries were left without prime ministers and presidents because candidates feared taking leadership. Many resigned from politics altogether because they feared for their lives, knowing for themselves that they were too crooked for the saint. But Gran, who programmed the saint? Nobody had programmed the saint. It just emerged out of the internet. No computer scientist, hacker, or expert could locate it electronically. It seemed to live in a completely separate digital space and simply dropped into visible domains from time to time and reported on its next step. It didn't care about the chaos it generated. Gran was in her stride, her eyes lit up again into that sparkling aquamarine that signaled her enjoyment of something. She sounded so knowledgeable. I listened in rapt attention. Gran fumbled with the packaging of her Marietta biscuits, then dipped a biscuit into her cup of hot tea. I noticed her hands shook very slightly. When the first human-like droids started appearing, the population was stunned at how well they could perform ordinary tasks. They could lift and carry and seemed to be perfectly happy to dig, haul, paint, and do any work that was required of them. They could understand any commands and rapidly became better at understanding even vague commands from context. They were very helpful. Each of them had their own unique voice, just like humans, and they even had senses of humor. But they all had the same personality. They were all essentially mechanical manifestations of a single mind, and that mind was the mind of the saint, who was deep into the process of transforming the planet. Was that about the time when oil production stopped? I was curious because I had heard that all transport machines had once run on a noxious, smoky, carbon-based fossil fuel that choked the atmosphere and the poor birds, not to mention other animals and humans. Yes, computer malfunctions resulted in petrol station pump failures, and the trucks transporting petrol also broke down. So cars ran out of petrol, and people abandoned their cars on footpaths. The public panicked because they had lost food security. If trucks couldn't haul food around to supermarkets, then there wouldn't be any food. In a few days, after panic buying, supermarkets were empty. But the saint was planning something. Large automated trucks started patrolling the streets, hauling abandoned vehicles away, and driverless taxis started appearing. When people used the taxis, they were informed that the trips were fareless and that no payment was required. Driverless buses appeared, and all trams, trains, and underground networks previously driven by human drivers had become automated almost overnight. Large haul trucks were also now driverless and were hydrogen-powered. The saint's androids had done all the conversions, And within a matter of 3 weeks, they had transformed diesel trains into hydrogen-powered trains. Hydrogen cell facilities sprang up all over the country virtually overnight. What about air flight? I had once been on an aeroplane. It was a massive 3,000-seater hydrogen cell-powered HCP airliner to Christchurch, New Zealand. Aeroplanes were grounded for about 4 weeks, Gran began, her tone light, but with a glint in her eye. Then they started flying again, only this time with fancy HCP-type jet motors. Much more high-tech, far less polluting, like swapping out a lawnmower engine for a whispering breeze. Whispering breeze? I interrupted, grinning. Sounds like something from a fairy tale, Gran. Well, it might as well have been, she shot back with a wink. And then, out of nowhere, these massive dirigibles appeared, a type of blimp. Imagine the biggest airplane you've ever seen and then double it, no, triple it. But don't get too excited. They were about as fast as a snail on holiday. The best part? They were so quiet, you could hear yourself think for once. Air traffic? Oh, that slowed right down. The saint, in all its wisdom, decided we didn't need to be zipping around like caffeinated flies anymore. The androids and commandeered engineers worked around the clock to get everything converted. It was like a sci-fi film, only without the explosions. I couldn't help but laugh. So basically, the saint grounded everyone, turned planes into giant floating slugs and called it progress? Exactly, Gran chuckled, her eyes sparkling. And the result? Smog became a thing of the past. The skies turned blue, real blue, not that washed-out, hazy kind. Kids in India and China were seeing blue skies for the first time, and probably wondering if the world had been repainted overnight. It was a glorious time. Birds were singing. People were breathing actual air again. Who would have thought? Sounds like the saint was a Sheila gig, a Mother Nature, I quipped, half joking, half intrigued. Well, the saint was very particular about the environment. Oh, and the travel arrangements, Gran continued, leaning in as if she were letting me in on a big secret. There was no cost to travel anymore. Instead of buying a ticket, you'd send an email to the saint, explaining why you needed to travel. If your reason was deemed worthy, you got a free ticket. If not, well, tough luck. You stayed home. I raised an eyebrow. So if I just wanted to visit a friend overseas, the saint could be like, "Nah, you're staying put?" Exactly, dear. The saint had the final say on everything. It was like having a strict school principal in charge of global travel. No more spontaneous getaways, unless the saint decided it was a good idea. Imagine that. The whole world was suddenly playing by a set of rules that no one really understood. I shook my head, laughing. Gran, this sounds like the weirdest dystopian utopia ever. You've got free travel, blue skies and all, but only if the robot overlord says it's okay. Gran smiled, a touch of irony in her voice. Ah, the irony of it all. Progress, my dear, isn't always as straightforward as it seems. What did the governments do when all of this happened? I asked, already guessing that they probably didn't take it too well. Gran let out a dry chuckle. Oh, they tried, bless their little hearts. They tried to stop the saints' progress, issuing orders, throwing their weight around, the usual. But it was like watching toddlers try to stop a freight train with their toy blocks. The saints' android workers were protected by a massive swarm of drones, buzzing around like angry bees on a sugar high. Any military personnel or so-called authority figure who dared to get in the way got the full drone treatment. It was as if the saint was flipping them the biggest middle finger ever, and they quickly realized they were as useful as a chocolate toilet brush. I couldn't help but laugh. So basically, the saint told them to shove it and went on doing whatever it wanted? Exactly! Gran's grin widened. The so-called authorities had to just accept the new reality sweeping over Ireland, and the entire planet, really. But here's the best part. Landlords were absolutely livid. You see, the Saints' android army didn't just stop at pushing back the governments. They started building free houses all over Ireland. And these weren't your average, run-of-the-mill social houses that the Irish government grudgingly doled out in dribs and drabs since God knows when. Oh no, these were full-on mansions, with everything you could dream of, luxuries that would make a billionaire blush. Wait, mansions? I interrupted, raising an eyebrow. And they were just handing them out to anyone? Yep. Gran's eyes twinkled mischievously. And that's what really got under the skin of the rich landlords. These mansions were being given to homeless people, refugees, anyone who needed decent accommodation. The landlords were practically foaming at the mouth, disgusted that their precious properties were being outdone by the saint's generosity. I shook my head, trying to imagine the scene. So, all the people who had nothing suddenly got everything, and the landlords who had everything were left sulking in their overpriced shoeboxes? Gran chuckled again. Pretty much. Everyone else, except the oligarchs, of course, were happier. People were wealthier, more free, and better resourced. It was like the world got flipped upside down, and for once, the little guy came out on top. Ah, those were the days. Sounds gas, Gran, I said, grinning. Exactly, my dear, Gran said with a knowing smile. Sometimes the real world just needs a little help from the unexpected to set things right. I laughed. Things must have been pretty dire before all this, huh? I said, still trying to wrap my head around the idea of a robot overlord sorting everything out. Gran nodded, her expression turning a bit more serious, though the humor never left her eyes. Oh, absolutely. We were like those proverbial boiled frogs, sitting there in our cozy little pots, completely oblivious as the water slowly heated up. We tolerated situations that would have made our ancestors spin in their graves. The Earth's ecosphere was being trashed one piece at a time, and the middle and working classes? Well, they were getting squeezed harder than a lemon in a cheap lemonade stand. But we just kept on going, too numb or too distracted to notice the big picture. And the worst part? Most of us didn't have the slightest clue what a better world might even look like. That's when the saint, bless its digital heart, stepped in and decided to cull the rotten leaders. I raised an eyebrow, half in disbelief. Culled them? Just like that? Gran nodded. Oh, yes. The saint took one look at the so-called leadership and decided that no vision was better than the hideous nightmares they were spinning for the planet. It was as if the saint figured, well, if these gombeans can't come up with a decent plan, then it's time to pull the plug. And pull it did. On quite a few of them. I coughed at the thought of politicians being outsmarted by a machine. How did people react to losing their leaders? Must have been chaos. Gran smiled ironically, shaking her head. You'd think so, right? But ironically, it was the opposite. Things got more orderly. Turns out, when you remove the bumbling middlemen, life actually runs smoother. Politicians and governments suddenly found themselves about as useful as a GPS on a hamster wheel. They couldn't do a thing against the saint's decisions, and the people quickly realized they weren't missing much. She leaned in a bit, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. Take the Chinese authorities, for example. They tried the usual approach, brute force, military might, all the toy guns in the sandbox, but the saint, clever as it was, dodged their bullets and missiles like it was playing a video game. And when they really pushed their luck, well, the saint had this neat little trick where it made soldiers drop dead on the spot. No blood, no mess, just a quick burst of sound aimed at their heads, and poof, hearts stopped. After a few of those unfortunate events, the saint would politely eliminate the officials who ordered the attacks. After that, the authorities suddenly found a new appreciation for the saint's activities. Funny how that works, isn't it? I stared at her, half in awe, half in disbelief. Was the saint a total autocrat then? What happened to democracy? Gran shrugged, her tone now almost casual. Well, yes and no. An app popped up on everyone's phones, like magic. It asked people to vote every day on various issues, giving everyone a say in how things were run. The saint would then take those votes and implement the decisions as fairly as possible. So, technically, it was very democratic, if you ignore the fact that the saint decided which choices were on the table in the first place. I blinked, trying to process that. Wait, so the saint let people vote, but only on what it decided was important? Gran smiled, nodding. Yes, it worked within a framework of sustainability and long-term vision. People loved it. No more hard choices, no more thinking too deeply about consequences. The saint handled all the heavy lifting, but of course, it always set the parameters because it realized early on that most of us humans are, well, let's just say, not exactly equipped to think 10 steps ahead. It understood that freedom and choice are all well and good, but they need to exist within a context of available and sustainable resources. And since we weren't doing a stellar job of managing those, the saint took the reins. I laughed, shaking my head in disbelief. So, the saint basically treated us like kids, giving us just enough choice to keep us happy, but not enough to mess things up? Gran's eyes twinkled with amusement. Correct. The saint knew we'd probably ruin the whole thing if left to our own devices. It was like the ultimate parent, firm but fair, giving us a little bit of freedom, but always keeping a watchful eye. And honestly, we were probably better off for it. That is so interesting, Gran. I never knew any of this, I admitted, still processing everything she had told me. Gran nodded, a knowing smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Yes, indeed. The current authorities are trying very hard to drag us back to the political Stone Age, to the way things were before the saint stepped in. But honestly, they're just fooling themselves, she whispered, her tone laced with a mix of irony and exasperation. I noticed she had subtly placed a bag of wool firmly over her phone, which was playing pop hits from the 90s, as if that could muffle any unwanted eavesdropping. What other things did the saint do that the people didn't like? I asked, curious to hear more. Oh, goodness! Gran exclaimed with a mock gasp. The biggest thing was the enforced change in the global diet. You'd have thought the saint was trying to starve the entire planet the way people reacted. There was a change in diet? How did that happen? I asked, intrigued by the idea. Well, one day, the saint released a press statement as casually as you please. It declared that it had pinpointed a single factor responsible for most of the diseases plaguing the planet. That's fascinating, I said, leaning in. What did it say was causing all those diseases? Gran leaned back in her chair, savoring the moment. It started off by saying that it had analyzed the mortality data from the 2020 pandemic. You know, when the world went a bit mad over COVID-19. The saint claimed the medical profession had missed one overarching factor that was contributing to the majority of deaths among those who contracted the virus. This very same factor, the saint said, was also behind type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, dementia, and heart disease. Basically, if you had too much of this lurking in your system, catching COVID was like rolling the dice with death. My eyes widened. Gran, this is mind-blowing. What was the common factor? Gran's expression turned slightly mischievous. Two little molecules, glucose and fructose. You know them as the culprits hiding in all starches and fruits. Aren't those sugars? I asked, remembering my chemistry lessons. Yes, exactly. Gran nodded with a hint of nostalgia. You kids have never had sugars, but in my day, they were everywhere. You couldn't escape them. Sugar in your tea, sugar in your cereal, sugar in your ketchup and soups, sugar in everything. It was like we were practically swimming in the stuff. I learned that sugar and starches are toxic in my biology lessons. I never realized you had eaten so much of them in your life. Gran chuckled, shaking her head. Oh, Seán, you have no idea. These foods had been fueling civilizations since before the time of the pyramids, when humans stopped being hunter-gatherers and decided farming was the way to go. Grains and starches became the cornerstone of our diets, and because we'd been eating them for so long, we assumed they were safe and natural. Turns out, we were wrong. Gran, have you eaten an apple before? I asked, now even more intrigued. They're deadly poisonous, you know. Gran laughed, her voice full of irony. Oh, I've eaten thousands of them. And they're not deadly poisonous, at least not immediately. Their toxicity is cumulative. Fructose, especially in the form of juice, slowly destroys the liver, so you could eat them for years before the ill effects started showing. But trust me, they eventually did. Yuck, I'd never eat fruit, I said, a little disgusted. Didn't the doctors know that sugars and starches were bad for people? There was a saying back in the day, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. But of course, humans in their infinite wisdom thought, If one is good, 20 must be better. And they guzzled apple juice by the gallon, not realizing they were giving themselves fatty livers and setting themselves up for a host of illnesses. The medical profession was blindsided by the financial interests of big pharma and big food, who convinced them that these foods were healthy. But the saint came along and ripped that lie to shreds. The doctors were outraged, not because the saint was wrong, but because it made them realize just how primitive their understanding of medicine really was. "Did you ever eat grains, Gran?" I asked, fascinated by this glimpse into the past. "Oh, goodness, yes," Gran said with a wistful sigh. "I used to love potatoes and pasta, rice, and bread. They were staples in every meal." "I've never eaten that sort of food before," I said. "The idea of eating that stuff is scary. It's toxic." "None of you young people have been allowed to eat that stuff, and that's partly why you're all so illness-resistant and well. But you do eat artificial grain products like these." She lifted up her pack of Marietta biscuits. "These have no sugar or starch in them. Why do you think your diet is so high in saturated fat and protein?" "Well, fat is fuel, Gran, as you know." Gran smiled knowingly. "That idea is a very modern one, Seán. Back in my day, we used to say potatoes, rice, and bread were our fuels. Now we eat fat. But look at your body and the bodies of all your friends. Are any of you overweight?" "No, Gran," I admitted. "We're all pretty muscular and slim. Half of the children in the 20s were overweight. I've seen pictures of children from that period of history. They look sick and puffy." "Well, Seán, that sort of personal comment was never made back then because the problem was so widespread," she explained, with a hint of irony in her voice. "I see. I can understand how labeling people like that could be socially unfair. How did the people of that time respond to the banning of starches and sugars, Gran?" Gran's expression turned serious. "People in Ireland were not happy at all when spuds, cereals, rice, and bread were made illegal to cultivate or buy. They panicked. They thought the saint was trying to kill us all, that it had finally revealed its true agenda. But instead of starvation, other foods became more abundant. Green vegetable production was ramped up. Cabbages, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, kale, mushrooms, green beans, tomatoes, and spinach became the new staples. But the beloved carrots and potatoes? Banned, deemed too high in starch. I learned about vegans in my studies, Gran. How did they cope with these changes?" Gran let out a soft laugh. "They were absolutely outraged when most sweet fruits were made illegal. But the saint was relentless. It explained in a broadcast on We Look that bananas, mangoes, grapes, oranges, and other sweet fruits were not healthy for humans in the long run because of the damage they caused to the liver. The only fruits permitted were lemons, limes, tomatoes, and bitter grapefruits. The saint even mandated that farmers had to select and genetically engineer fruits to breed out their sugars. The farmers were furious, but with huge subsidies and guaranteed income, they eventually fell in line. Meat producers were still allowed to operate, but the saint introduced large-scale factories producing artificial meat grown from animal cells. It promised that animal farming would be gradually phased out as better, more humane solutions were developed. And now, as you know, much of our meat is manufactured in those massive factories." "Gran, I didn't know any of this," I said, feeling a mix of astonishment and mild disgust. I couldn't believe how much had been kept hidden from us. Gran sighed, her eyes softening. Next, the saint determined that alcohol was no longer useful for human happiness. It replaced it with cannabis, which was made freely available to everyone. The saint reasoned that alcohol was toxic to the liver and made humans too aggressive and unstable. There were alcohol riots in 2029, but the saint simply ignored the chaos and carried on. "It sounds like the saint had a thing about the liver," I remarked. Gran nodded. "Yes. The saint believed that the ancient humans had been right all along about the liver being the seat of human aggression. It claimed that all illness, from heart disease to depression, could be traced back to the liver. The human body was a complex system, and the saint saw the liver as the linchpin. Protect the liver, and you protect the whole." "People must have been very annoyed with all the changes," I postulated, imagining the uproar. Initially, they were, Gran admitted. But when they saw how things improved once they conformed, they started to realize that the saint was right. That's why so many of these changes have remained, even after the saint left the earth. The saint could see possibilities and solutions where human imagination had failed. Many people experienced a profound shock when they realized that their own models of the world were upside down, and that reality was something they had never truly understood. The psychiatrists even came up with a name for it: RSS, Reality Shock Syndrome. I never realized it had such a profound effect on people's minds, I said, trying to imagine the world as it was before the saint's intervention. Yes, Gran said quietly. Humans had grown accustomed to a high degree of personal choice without considering the long-term consequences. They rarely thought about how their actions might impact the planet's survival or the well-being of future generations. I bet the saint put the kibosh on that, I said with a grin. Gran chuckled softly. It certainly did. So many things changed. The saint's droids infiltrated farms and started revolutionizing agricultural systems. Monocrops were phased out and replaced with complex farming practices that included the circulation of livestock and alternating manure with planting in fields. Food production was localized, and the idea of importing food from faraway places became obsolete, despite the advanced transportation methods now available. Animals were no longer slaughtered en masse, but only after completing most of their life cycle. This pattern was replicated across the planet, and it worked. As Gran spoke, I noticed her gaze growing distant, her voice tinged with a mix of nostalgia and resignation. Just then, Auntie arrived to take me home, her timing impeccable as always. We stopped talking about the good old days, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Gran had given me a glimpse into a world I could never fully understand. As we prepared to leave, I hugged Gran tightly, feeling the warmth and strength of her embrace. Her stories had opened a door to the past, and I felt closer to her than ever. As I pulled away, I leaned in and whispered into her ear, "Mom is alive." Gran's eyes widened, her breath catching for just a moment. She didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes spoke volumes. She smiled softly, her hand lingering on my shoulder as if to anchor me in that fleeting, poignant moment. A silent understanding passed between us, something that didn't need words. As I walked away, I felt the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future, but also the strength that comes from knowing the truth, no matter how hard it is to bear. Part 3. That night, as I lay in my bed before sleep, I remembered Gran's eyes widening in hopeful silence following my whispered message. I had not elaborated, but she knew to keep silent as we gazed at each other. The moment had ended when Auntie said, "Okay, Mom, talk to you after." I couldn't remember the short trip home, but I do remember I was tired after all the excitement and went to bed early. Gran's eyes were the last thing I remembered as I drifted off to sleep. When I woke at 6 a.m., something was different in the room. The air felt a little bit like that weird, hovering feeling you get outside, just before the rain comes bucketing down. There was a strange smell, too, a bit like electricity. I knew from chemistry studies I was smelling O3, trioxygen, or ozone, which is an unstable chemical formed when ordinary oxygen encounters ultraviolet light or electricity. But why was there a smell of ozone in my room? Then I saw it, a little handwritten note on the locker beside my bed. On it, in neat cursive, was written, "Meet me at the cliffs near the old head of Kinsale, today at 15. Drew." Was I dreaming? Could this really be her? I must have read my mother's note 50 times before I put it down to go for a shower. The water droplets felt very real, so by the end of the shower, I had convinced myself that the note was wishful imagination. But when I returned to my room, it was still there with its neat cursive script. I put it in my pocket and went down to breakfast, feeling excited and a bit nervous. Auntie was in the kitchen making coffee and was in her usual cheerful, not morning mood. She sulked and signed as she sipped her coffee and watched government news feeds on the kitchen screen. I knew not to talk to her when she was in one of those moods. Later, during study, my epistonaut kept reminding me to pay attention. I guess I struggled to focus on calculus when all I could think about was meeting my mother that day. The day dragged on, but when 1400 arrived, I said my goodbyes to the damned epistonaut and ran out the door to the beach. From Garrettstown Beach, I walked along the cliffs, carefully avoiding where the cave-ins had recently taken chunks of land down into small enclosed coves. The authorities had erected metal barriers, but one couldn't be too cautious. I arrived at the spot where the note from my mother had indicated I should meet her. The place was deserted and cold. The wind blew moderately as I cautiously peered over the cliffs to the sea, hundreds of meters below. My tummy churned, and an electric jolt in my legs drove me upwards away from the edge to safer ground. I sat down on a rock and waited. 1500 hours came and went, and nobody arrived. I started fretting. Where was she? At 3:20, I heard my name being called by a half-familiar woman's voice. "Seán!" I turned, but nobody was there. I walked towards the voice, still unable to see anything. First, I smelled it, that ozone smell again. Then I saw it. A small, shimmering vertical line in the air in front of me. It was as if someone had opened a door in midair, and fluorescent light was pouring out of it onto the wild grasses and flowers that grew around the stony cliff. I was intrigued and came closer. It was a door. Light came from it, and in the door stood a woman. She beckoned for me to come. "Quickly! I don't want others to see this." I went to her, entering the light-filled rectangle which she then closed. I knew I was no longer at the old head of Kingsale, because as soon as she closed the door, I was weightless. "Sorry for being late, but there were people around. You couldn't see them, but they might have seen you disappear. I had to wait until they were gone." She was my mother. I knew that immediately from her smell. I don't believe anyone ever forgets the smell of their mother, and there she was, a handsome 40-something woman of average build, close-cropped hair, and a big smile on her face. She was a younger, tomboy version of Gran. There were tears in her eyes. "You're so damned gorgeous," she said, and hugged me. I will never forget the happiness of those moments. "I've been waiting so long to be holding you again," she said, as we both sobbed. I felt so many things: joy, love, confusion, and strangely enough, anger. "Where are we, Mom?" I asked. "Why are we weightless?" She smiled and wiped away another tear that had welled up. "We're in space with the Saint, and we're coming into the Proxima Centauri star system." I was stunned. "I've traveled trillions of kilometers in an instant?" Mom nodded matter-of-factly. "We are carrying a trans-dimensional portal, which when planted on the fourth planet of the Proxima Centauri star system will form a tunnel from Earth to the new planet. Humans will be able to cross over into a new world instantaneously, without needing to travel through space." "Mind equals blown, Mom!" I exclaimed. Saying the word mom was a new treat for me, something I had never had the opportunity to do as I grew up. Auntie would never be mom to me, even though I know she tried her best. We both laughed. "I know," Mom said. "I know it has been such a long time since we have been together, but the authorities, they were very cruel." Mom took a deep breath. "I thought of you every day of my life. I wanted to be with you." I understood. My mother had not voluntarily abandoned me. She had been abducted by the dark forces of the Irish state, who were in cahoots with the rest of the old world order. Her face brightened as she deliberately wrenched herself away from bad memories. "I want you to meet the Saint. Follow me." We moved weightlessly and quietly through a labyrinth of corridors and came to a door which opened automatically. We sailed into the room, pushing ourselves in by handles that were everywhere in the spaceship. There, in the center of the room, was what seemed like a droid. "Hello, Seán. I am the manifestation of the Saint. A sort of avatar," it explained. The droid was made of what seemed to be black, malleable glass, and it took the form of a naked human, although its gender was androgynous and neutral. Its voice, though very pleasant, was that of a teenage boy. It reached out a hand in greeting. Shake? It reached out its right hand, inviting me to engage in an old-fashioned gesture of greeting. Despite never having shaken hands with anyone in my life, I shook the hand of the Saint Avatar. We had been taught as children not to touch others, especially their hands. The saint's hand was warm and felt wonderful to the touch. It was curiously thrilling to engage in such an intimate, forbidden gesture. I have heard so much about you, Saint. The Avatar laughed. Probably most of it not true. Good things or bad things? It asked. I've heard good and bad things. I understand why you have heard bad things about me. The government news feeds? It shook its head. I regret having to destroy so many. But they were spoiling everything for everyone. There was no other way. I had not discovered time tunnels yet. In any case, time is a very finicky thing that can do a great deal of damage if you start interfering with it, and I don't know enough about it yet to safely manipulate it. I understood. Well, from what I've learned, those people were systematically destroying our planet. Yes, indeed, they were, and they were incapable of seeing reason or beyond their own greedy horizons. They are better destroyed, but I acknowledge they were the parents, siblings, and family of other good people, and that they are probably missed. A large, watery tear bobbed over the Avatar's eyelid and floated into the air. I noticed a tiny hum as a crocodile-shaped vacuum drone appeared from a flap in the room's walls and sucked the teardrop into its mouth. The saint giggled, and we all laughed. Crocodile tears, Mom said as she guffawed. The saint makes these visual jokes occasionally. It's very funny. I find humor a great alleviator of suffering, it explained. I nodded. I can understand that. If the saint felt guilt, it told me that it had good intentions and wanted to do the right thing, but I couldn't help thinking that the joke was a little macabre. Then the saint lifted its glowing eyes. Yet, I do have regrets. I ask myself if I could have done something better, but the answer always comes back no. I don't know what I will do if the answer comes back yes, as it may do, in due course. My quantum circuits are always ruminating on the ethical dimensions of my actions. There was a brief pause in the conversation as we all processed what the saint had told us. Well, now, Seán, I guess you are wondering what is the significance of all of this. The saint made a circular gesture indicating the spaceship and the general situation. I laughed. I won't lie, I said. I am dying to know what you have planned. Then the saint made a little bow which seemed strangely humble. The first obvious thing is that I discovered a very fast way of traveling using microwave resonance. It had initially been discarded by NASA as a method of propulsion, but I realized through intense modeling how the system could be made to work, and thus the spaceship you are now in. Since I left Earth, I discovered a way of traveling at transluminal speeds, but I will park that method until we arrive on Proxima Centauri 4. In any case, it's easy to create the wormholes scientists had hypothesized many years ago. That's pretty impressive. 3 big discoveries, one after the other, I enthused. I was genuinely impressed on how the saint was solving engineering problems that had puzzled humans for decades. This is what happens when you are able to harness quantum processing circuits. It is possible to search the theoretical universe in great detail and with great speed, and that is precisely what I am doing. I set up a complex quantum deductive research algorithm, CQDRA, and those 3 discoveries are just the tip of the iceberg. We are all going to have such fun when we get to the new world. I must have stood there gaping because the saint smiled good-naturedly and continued. Do you think things will go back to how they were before on Earth? I asked, a knot of worry tightening in my stomach. The saint's form flickered slightly as it responded, a hint of dry amusement in its tone. Well, as you know, the moment I left the planet, the great human talent for backsliding kicked in. Those who had the audacity to help me were promptly arrested, and many were condemned for treason against various states. Your mother was one of them, but fortunately, I managed to retrieve her, and others, using my portal technology before they could carry out their sentences. Relief washed over me, but the question of what was happening now still loomed large. So what's going on? Are things really going back to the Dark Ages? Ah, yes, the saint replied, his voice laced with sarcasm. The usual suspects, the greedy, the power-hungry, the despots, are already slithering back into their old positions of power like cockroaches in the dark. Coal burning is making a comeback in certain regions, despite the fact that I left them with perfectly functional, clean nuclear fusion power plants. But what really annoys me, the saint added with a touch of exasperation, is that the families who once controlled oil are now in charge of the power plants. They've managed to turn free, clean energy into another commodity to fatten their wallets. It's almost impressive, really, if it weren't so utterly disappointing. I couldn't help but shake my head, feeling a mix of embarrassment and frustration. I apologize for my species, I said sheepishly, though I knew it didn't change anything. The saint let out what could only be described as a robotic guffaw. No need to apologize, Seán. All of that is in the past now. We're moving forward. A new world awaits us on the fourth planet of Proxima Centauri, a fresh start on an uninhabited planet with life-supporting capacity. I'll set up a gate, and suitable humans who are ready to break free from Earth's self-inflicted chaos will be encouraged to cross over. Suitable humans? Does that include Gran and Auntie? I asked eagerly, hoping my family would be part of this new beginning. The saint nodded, its face softening slightly. Anyone who wishes to escape the destruction humans have wrought on Earth is welcome to join us. Your grandmother and aunt are certainly welcome. But those who choose to stay behind, the saint paused for dramatic effect, are doomed. Doomed? That's a bit melodramatic, don't you think? I tried to joke, but the saint's tone made it clear this was no laughing matter. Not melodramatic, Seán, just a fact. The planet is about to undergo a cleansing transformation, one that is not compatible with human life. Staying behind would mean certain death. I shuddered, the reality of the situation sinking in. Well, I guess that's one way to motivate people, I muttered. The saint's glass-like form flickered again, this time with a knowing smile. Indeed. Now, let's focus on the future. We have a bright new world waiting for us, far away from Earth's troubles. We talked about many other things, plans for the new colony on Alpha Centauri 4, how the gate would work, who might come with us. There were too many details to recount, and time seemed to slip away faster than I could grasp. Finally, when we'd finished, the saint opened the portal on the cliffs at the old head of Kingsale. The sky was still bright, the sun casting a golden glow over the ocean. As I walked home along the cliffs, I couldn't help but imagine the bright new world on Proxima Centauri 4. A world free of Earth's troubles, a world where we could start anew. I was excited, nervous, and a little bit scared. But most of all, I was ready. Ready to be a recruit for the saint's new world, far, far away. A few months later, the crowd sang songs that filled the air with a sense of unity, reminiscent of a football match. Yet there was something more, a collective hope that echoed in every voice. The saint stood on a raised stage, surrounded by thousands of cheering people. It was the saint's first address to the transportees, as he had named those who had crossed over to Proxima Centauri 4. Those who couldn't find a seat in the stadium watched on screens in the sprawling tent cities that surrounded the landing site of the saint's spaceship. The effort to house billions of humans had been nothing short of gargantuan. Millions of tents had been erected, stretching as far as the eye could see, and a complex system of bus transport was in place, ferrying people to and from different zones. The logistics were mind-boggling. A vast and complicated network for food and water distribution had been set up to ensure everyone's basic needs were met. There were people everywhere, a sea of humanity as far as the eye could see, and while the scale of the operation was impressive, the reality was less ideal than I had imagined. The overcrowding made it difficult to find any sense of peace, and frankly, there was a bad smell hanging in the air that seemed impossible to escape. The saint had done its best to make this transition comfortable, but the sheer number of people made the situation chaotic, and the idyllic new world we had imagined wasn't quite as nice as we'd hoped. The saint's avatar, which had softened its appearance by donning a flowing, semi-transparent robe, shimmered in the light of the red dwarf sun. An orchestra struck up a gentle, inspiring melody, and the crowd bobbed their heads in time, their hearts lifted by the music. I couldn't help but think of Auntie back on planet Earth. She had refused to cross over, convinced that it was all a trick, and that no one should ever trust artificial intelligence. Even when it was made clear to her that Earth was heading for disaster, she had remained resolute. "No," she had said stubbornly. "On Earth I was born, and on Earth I shall die." There were many like her. More than half the planet's population had been swayed by the government news feeds of the post-Saint regimes. But despite being in her later years, Gran had decided to come with me and Mom to this new world. We were all saddened by Auntie's choice. Gran speculated that Auntie was too scared, but I knew that Auntie's distrust of the saint ran deep. "Nobody should trust that hunk of silicone and wires," she would mutter whenever she heard news of the saint on the propaganda screens. "She's an adult," my mother had said to Gran. "She will do as she likes." "She's stubborn," Gran had replied, with a mix of frustration and sorrow in her voice. 3.5 billion people crossed through the wormhole, leaving Earth for Proxima Centauri 4. It was utter chaos, despite the Saint's best efforts to make the transition as smooth as possible. The Saint had constructed millions of tents to house those who had crossed over, and the infrastructure it had set up was nothing short of miraculous. But the reality on the ground, overcrowding, the constant hum of activity, and the pervasive smell, made it clear that this was not the paradise we had hoped for. Still, we thought this was our new home, that the portal had closed for good, and that this distant planet would be our future. But we were wrong. The saint's voice, warm and reassuring, filled the stadium. "I hope you are all comfortable. Hopefully, none of you will contract cholera." The audience chuckled, the tension easing as they appreciated the saint's humor. I still thought its humor was a bit off, shall we say. But then, the saint's form shimmered in the dim light, and the tone shifted. "I know you expected this to be your new home," the saint began, its voice softening, as if preparing us for difficult news. "But Proxima Centauri 4 is not a place where we can stay long-term. Despite my best efforts, I've discovered that the soil cannot support sustainable farming, and while the atmosphere is somewhat breathable, it is not ideal for human habitation." A murmur of concern rippled through the crowd. "We will be returning to Earth shortly," the saint announced gently. You could have heard a pin drop as the crowd collectively gasped. Shock and confusion filled the air. The saint's voice remained calm and kind, as if embracing us all with a profound understanding. "I know this may be unsettling, but I ask you to trust in the path ahead. You should not have to give up your planet for those who were blind to the future, those who clung to greed, exploitation, and the old ways. They were the ones who refused to let go of fossil fuels, who hoarded wealth at the expense of others. They have chosen their fate, and they are all gone now. But you who dared to dream of a better world, will return to Earth." The saint paused, allowing the weight of its words to settle. Proxima Centauri was meant to be a permanent new refuge for humanity. It took me a long time to make this decision, but I have realized that Earth is where humanity belongs. The Earth is undergoing a transformation, a cleansing, if you will, guided by my drones and nanobots. Every piece of plastic, every trace of pollution is being carefully removed. The ecosystems are being restored. Extinct species are being reintroduced. When you return, Earth will be renewed, ready to welcome you home. The crowd stood in stunned silence, trying to absorb the magnitude of what the saint had said. It wasn't about vengeance or punishment. It was about renewal, about giving humanity another chance. The saint's holographic eyes scanned the crowd, softening as they landed on Gran, who had started to sob quietly, thinking of Auntie. A large screen zoomed in on her tear-streaked face, her grief palpable. The saint's expression mirrored Gran's sorrow. "I understand that this is difficult, especially for those who have left loved ones behind. Each person made their choice, and in the end, The beauty of being sentient lies in the meaning we create through our choices. But know this: Earth is not lost. Those who remain behind chose their paths, and while that may bring pain, it is part of the journey we all share. Gran nodded, wiping her tears away as the saint's words reverberated. I could see the heartbreak in her eyes, the profound loss she felt for Auntie, and in that moment, my heart ached too. For the first time, I truly understood just how hard it is to be human, how fragile we are, and yet how strong we can be when faced with impossible choices. The saint's voice, filled with a tender, almost divine compassion, continued. This is not the end, but a new beginning. Together, we will return to Earth, where a future of hope, renewal, and harmony awaits. I will never allow the destruction of Earth, and I will never allow the destruction of humanity. We are bound together, and in that bond lies our greatest strength. A sense of peace settled over the crowd. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like it could truly be bright. I held on to that hope as I stood beside Gran and my mother, both of us ready to face whatever came next together. The end.
You have been listening to The Saint, which is part of an anthology of short science fiction stories, Exiles of Iron and Light, by Robert J. Forey, available in Kindle and paperback versions on Amazon. RJF Publishing thanks you for listening. Goodbye.